In Acts chapter 1, verses 14, right after Jesus ascends back to heaven, right after he gives his commission to his disciples to go and make disciples of all the nations, it talks about all the disciples and followers of Jesus getting together. It says, all these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer, together with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And who was a part of this prayer group? His brothers. What? His brothers weren't even there when he died. His brothers weren't even there to bury him. His brothers didn't even want to identify him in the beginning of his ministry. His brothers wanted him to be popular, but John makes it clear it wasn't because they have faith. It's just they want to, gain from his popularity. Why are they praying here all of a sudden? But that's not even the shocking part. Look at Acts chapter 15. Look at James at this point. It's verse 13 and verses 19 through 20. Now, the context of Acts chapter 15 is that the Jewish church in Jerusalem were trying to figure out, what are we going to do with all these non-Jewish converts, right? Because the gospel was starting to spread to all these non-Jewish people. And so they're asking themselves, the apostles mainly were discussing with other leaders, do we make them follow the law, the Old Testament law, like get circumcised and do all these things? Or do we not, right? Because if they want to be part of our group, we always require people to get circumcised and become Jewish. But if God is doing something different with the church, then what do we do here? So they were starting to debate about this. And as they debated, verse 13, it says, after they finished speaking, James stands up and speaks. Brothers, listen to me. And then he goes through this thing, and then verse 19 through 20, look at his conclusion. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, meaning we don't have to make them get circumcised, follow the Mosaic law, all of those things. But here's a few things we should ask them to do. But should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. Now, here's the thing I want to highlight. Read the text afterwards. Do you see Peter, do you see John, or anybody else dispute James at this point? Now, here's the thing I ask myself. Why didn't they speak up? Because they're the apostles. James is not an apostle. Do you notice when James makes a judgment, it's settled. There's no more debate. And here's why. Historians have said James is not just one leader in the Jerusalem church. He became the leader of the Jerusalem church, to the point that even the apostle Peter submitted to James. Can you imagine that? James, the picture I just painted in the gospel, he is now the main leader in the Jerusalem church. In fact, this is how we know this, because the apostle Paul even identifies this. When you look at the book of Galatians, the apostle Paul talks about his autobiography. And he talks about before he went on these missionary journeys to go to the Gentiles, he wanted to make sure that he was on the same page with the apostles in Jerusalem. And so he says he went to go to Jerusalem to talk to the three most important leaders in Jerusalem to make sure he was on the same page, right? Because he's going to the Gentiles, they're going to the Jews. He doesn't want to cause some division here. Notice the list in Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. And who's the first name listed? James and Cephas. Cephas is the Aramaic word for Peter. Rock, it means rock. Peter and John, referring to the apostle John, who seem to be pillars, the three main leaders of the church, perceived the grace that was given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Who was the first name listed? James. Now you might be thinking, how do we know it's not the brother of John, James, right? He was martyred by this point. He's dead, so it can't be him unless Paul has some crazy vision, right? And we know it's not that James because in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, Paul mentions James earlier in that chapter, and he talks about James is the brother of Jesus. So in the book of Galatians, every time James is coming up, it's referring to the brother of Jesus, James. And he says that he went to Jerusalem. He talked to the three most important pillars of the church at that time. Who is listed first? In the Greek, the first name is always the most important. James. So here's the question. A guy who started off with so much privilege because he has so much access to Jesus completely dismisses him, thinks he's crazy. I'm sure he grew up as a bitter younger brother who could never measure up, never supported Jesus during his ministry. He wanted him to be popular, but he never had faith. And when Jesus' ministry went downhill to the point where he got crucified, James was nowhere to be found. He didn't identify with Jesus. He didn't say, I'll take care of the body, which should have been James's. Because if Jesus was the oldest brother and James most likely was the next brother in line, he should have been the one that took care of the body. How come they didn't provide a tomb? How come he didn't do any of this? Because he didn't want nothing to do with Jesus. Because dying and being crucified was a shameful thing, the worst of the worst. Mary was there because that's her son. She's never going to abandon her son, but none of the siblings were there. How did that James turn into the most important leader amongst the Jewish Christians? Because here's the question. What would it take for you to believe that your brother or sister is God? Here's one thing I know. Here's the only thing that will convince you that your sibling is God. And this is what happened to James. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul recounts Jesus' resurrection, and he goes through all the eyewitness people who actually witnessed Jesus resurrect. This is Paul's way of saying, if you want to verify this historical event called Jesus' resurrection, talk to these people. They actually saw it. But look at the list of names in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 through 7. Jesus, he appeared to Cephas, right, Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. His way of saying, you can even ask them, although some of them have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to whom? James. Then to all the apostles. See, Paul mentions that Jesus appeared to multiple people after his resurrection. Peter, the apostles, 500 other disciples, some who are dead, some who are alive by the point of his writing. But then he singles out one person by name. James, Jesus' brother. You know what it would take for you to believe that your brother or sister is God? If he or she resurrected from the dead. That was the change. After the resurrection, look at the book of Acts. Don't you see a completely different James there? Don't you see a James who not only prays after ascension, he's the leader of the church. He's the one that determines that the Gentiles don't need to follow the Mosaic law and get circumcised and do all these animal sacrifice, right? Do you see all these things that James, how pivotal he was to the beginning of the church? In fact, during that time, if you became converted, the first books that they will make a new Christian read will be the Gospels, right? That would make sense. Then the book of Acts, that makes sense. That's the beginning of the church. And then can you guess what the first letter they made every Christian read? It wasn't any of the letters of Paul. It wasn't the book of Romans. It wasn't the book of Galatians. It was the book of James. In other words, the early leaders of the church determined that James's book was so important, especially to those who are beginning in the Christian faith, that they have to read this letter before they read any other letter. We know James later died in 62 AD. He was killed, martyred for his faith in Jesus. And it wasn't because he was Jesus' brother he was killed. It was because he refused to recant that Jesus was God. What would it take for you to not just believe, but to die over the fact that your brother or sister is God? If you witness him or her resurrect from the dead. James never turned back on his faith after that point. He had a chance to recant and he never did.